Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. The dust had barely settled from the gunshots when Étienne Moreau dropped to one knee in the middle of the Arizona desert, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline of surviving what should have been his final stagecoach journey as a Wells Fargo security guard. While the masked bandit who had just robbed their coach stood frozen with smoking pistol in hand, her emerald eyes wide with shock above the black bandana that concealed her identity but could not hide the feminine curves that her loose clothing had failed to disguise during the robbery that had just transformed from routine criminal enterprise into something that defied every assumption about frontier crime and romance. The ring that Étienne pulled from his vest pocket caught the afternoon sunlight like captured fire, its diamond surface reflecting light that seemed to illuminate the impossible moment when a man chose love over logic and proposed marriage to the outlaw who had just stolen everything he owned except his heart, which she had unknowingly claimed during the brief conversation that had preceded the robbery when her cultured voice and gentle manner had suggested education and refinement that no common criminal should have possessed. The other passengers cowered behind the overturned stagecoach, their terrified whispers creating a chorus of disbelief as they witnessed the most extraordinary marriage proposal in territorial history. The words that came from Étienne's lips were spoken with conviction that surprised even him, as months of loneliness and professional dedication to protecting other people's wealth had crystallized into recognition that the woman pointing a gun at his chest represented everything he had been seeking without knowing it: intelligence, courage, independence, and beauty that transcended the criminal circumstances of their meeting while challenging every assumption about proper courtship and feminine behavior that civilized society demanded from respectable women who would never dream of robbing stagecoaches or living outside the law that governed normal romantic relationships. The silence that followed his proposal stretched across the desert like a held breath, while tumbleweeds rolled past the frozen tableau of armed bandit and kneeling suitor whose declaration of love had transformed routine robbery into dramatic confrontation between outlaw independence and civilized marriage that represented security and social acceptance at the cost of freedom and adventure, that frontier life could provide for women brave enough to reject conventional limitations and create their own destiny through whatever means survival demanded in territories where law enforcement was distant and personal protection required individual capability. When the masked woman's gun hand began to lower slowly while her other hand reached toward the bandana that concealed her identity, Étienne held his breath with recognition that the next moments would either vindicate his impossible gamble on love at first sight or result in his death at the hands of the woman whose criminal profession had somehow captured his heart more completely than any respectable lady in civilized society had ever managed through conventional courtship and proper social introduction that followed established rules for romantic attachment between men and women whose compatibility was measured by social position rather than the immediate recognition of kindred spirits that dangerous circumstances had revealed. The assignment that had brought Étienne Moreau to territorial Arizona was motivated by Wells Fargo's desperate need for experienced security personnel who could protect valuable shipments from systematic robbery by organized criminal gangs whose success had made normal stagecoach operations prohibitively dangerous for passengers and cargo that represented economic lifeline for frontier communities whose prosperity depended on reliable transportation and communication with eastern markets that provided manufactured goods in exchange for territorial resources that mining and ranching operations could provide through hazardous overland shipping routes. The reputation that Étienne had earned through 5 years of successful protection work in California included expertise with firearms and tactical knowledge that had enabled him to survive multiple robbery attempts while preserving cargo and passenger safety, despite increasingly sophisticated criminal techniques that exceeded simple highway bandits through organized operations, that suggested military training and systematic intelligence gathering about shipment schedules and security measures that conventional protection methods could not address without enhanced personnel and resources. The transfer to Arizona Territory was accompanied by significant salary increase and promise of promotion that reflected Wells Fargo's recognition of his professional competence, while the challenging assignment provided opportunity for career advancement that could establish foundation for marriage and family life that his nomadic existence as traveling security guard had made impossible despite growing desire for personal relationships and domestic stability that solitary life was preventing through constant travel and occupational dangers that made emotional attachments inadvisable for men whose survival depended on maintaining focus. The loneliness that had accumulated through years of professional dedication was intensified by witnessing countless reunions between passengers and their families at destination towns, where his own arrival was marked only by duty reports and preparation for subsequent assignments that required immediate departure for new routes and different dangers that prevented establishment of personal connections or romantic relationships with women whose lives were rooted in specific communities rather than constant movement between territorial settlements that provided temporary accommodation rather than permanent residence. The hope that Arizona assignment might provide opportunity for establishing permanent residence and normal social relationships was based on company promises about extended territorial duty and potential advancement to administrative position that could eliminate constant travel while utilizing his experience for training new security personnel whose recruitment was essential for expanding protection services that territorial development was demanding. Despite criminal threats that made conventional employment dangerous for men whose families could become targets for retaliation by criminal organizations whose success depended on intimidating honest workers and law enforcement officials. The reports that had reached Wells Fargo headquarters about Arizona robberies included detailed descriptions of systematic criminal operations that exceeded normal frontier banditry through careful planning and execution that suggested professional training and intelligence gathering capability that organized criminal gangs typically possessed through experienced leadership and coordinated operations that challenged conventional protection methods through superior tactics and equipment that individual security guards could not address without enhanced resources and systematic countermeasures that required institutional response rather than reliance on individual competence. The pattern that was emerging through accumulated intelligence revealed criminal organization whose success rate exceeded anything previous territorial experience had produced. While their systematic avoidance of bloodshed and professional courtesy toward passengers suggested leadership that valued reputation and long-term operations over immediate profit, that violent methods might provide through terrorizing potential victims whose cooperation could be obtained through intimidation rather than actual harm, that would provoke enhanced law enforcement response and federal intervention that could eliminate criminal operations through systematic investigation and prosecution. The mystery that was particularly puzzling to law enforcement officials involved recent robberies that appeared to be conducted by single individual whose capability and success rate defied conventional understanding about criminal operations that typically required multiple participants for overwhelming defensive capability and managing multiple passengers whose resistance could endanger criminal success unless sufficient manpower was available for controlling situation through superior numbers and firepower that individual criminals could not provide regardless of personal skill and tactical knowledge. The witness descriptions that were collected by territorial marshals included conflicting reports about bandits' appearance and behavior, while consistent references to cultured speech and educated manner suggested background that exceeded typical criminal experience through formal education and social refinement. that respectable upbringing could provide rather than frontier circumstances that usually produced criminal behavior through desperation and lack of legitimate opportunities for economic advancement that drove honest persons to illegal activities when survival demanded choices between starvation and crime. The investigation that was being conducted by federal authorities included systematic analysis of robbery patterns and criminal methodology that revealed sophisticated understanding of stagecoach operations and security procedures that inside information could provide through collaboration with transportation employees or systematic surveillance of operational procedures that careful observation could detect, despite security measures that were designed to prevent criminal intelligence gathering about shipment schedules and protection arrangements that successful robberies required for optimal timing and tactical advantage. The woman who called herself Céleste Dubois had arrived in Amaranth Creek 6 months earlier with sufficient funds to purchase modest house and establish herself as seamstress, whose skills and refined manner quickly earned respect from townspeople whose initial suspicion of unmarried woman living independently was overcome by her obvious education and ladylike behavior that challenged frontier assumptions about feminine independence while demonstrating capability for honest self-support that respectable widowhood could provide through practical skills and careful financial management that avoided dependence on masculine protection or community charity. The background story that she provided about deceased husband and inheritance that had enabled Western relocation was accepted without question by community members whose own experience with frontier migration included numerous personal tragedies and fresh starts that discouraged detailed inquiry into newcomers' previous circumstances. While her obvious grief and reluctance to discuss personal history were interpreted as natural response to loss rather than deliberate concealment of information that more thorough investigation might have revealed through systematic questioning that frontier communities typically avoided out of respect for individual privacy. The business that she established served community need for professional sewing and alteration services that frontier circumstances required for maintaining proper appearance and extending clothing life through repair and modification that imported garments needed for adaptation to territorial climate and working conditions. While her reasonable prices and excellent craftsmanship created steady clientele among women whose domestic responsibilities included family clothing maintenance, that her specialized skills could accomplish more efficiently than amateur efforts that time constraints and lack of training made inadequate for producing professional results. The social position that she gradually achieved within community included participation in church activities and charitable work that demonstrated moral character and civic responsibility, while her contributions to community welfare through volunteer service and generous donations to worthy causes created reputation for public-spirited citizenship that effectively concealed nocturnal activities that would have shocked respectable neighbors whose trust and acceptance she had systematically cultivated through careful presentation of feminine virtue and Christian devotion that provided perfect cover for criminal operations that required legitimate identity and community integration. The skills that she possessed included horsemanship and marksmanship that exceeded normal feminine accomplishments through extensive training that her mysterious background had provided, while tactical knowledge and criminal planning capability suggested experience that respectable widowhood could not have produced without exposure to influences that proper ladies would never encounter through conventional social education that emphasized domestic accomplishments, rather than outdoor skills and self-defense capabilities that frontier survival sometimes required from women whose safety depended on individual competence rather than masculine protection that isolation made unavailable. The success that marked Celeste's criminal career was achieved through meticulous planning and systematic intelligence gathering that enabled her to select targets with precision that minimized risk while maximizing profit. while her careful avoidance of violence and respectful treatment of robbery victims created unusual reputation among territorial criminals whose methods typically included intimidation and brutality that she considered both unnecessary and counterproductive for maintaining long-term operations that required community tolerance and limited law enforcement response that excessive violence would eliminate through federal intervention and systematic investigation. The profits that her criminal activities generated were carefully invested in legitimate business expansion and community improvement projects that enhanced her reputation for civic responsibility while providing additional cover for explaining financial resources that seamstress income could not account for without arousing suspicion from neighbors whose observation of her lifestyle might have revealed inconsistencies between stated occupation and actual standard of living that criminal income was enabling through systematic theft from wealthy passengers whose losses were absorbed by insurance companies rather than individual victims. The technique that she had developed for robbery operations included detailed surveillance of stagecoach schedules and passenger manifests that systematic observation could provide through careful monitoring of transportation hub activities and strategic placement of informants whose cooperation she purchased through generous payment rather than intimidation that might have created enemies whose testimony could endanger her operations through law enforcement cooperation that voluntary assistance would not provide despite financial motivation that made information gathering reliable and systematic. The disguise that she employed during criminal operations included masculine clothing and behavioral modification that concealed feminine identity while creating impression of experienced male bandit whose competence and professionalism masked true gender identity that discovery would compromise through social scandal and legal consequences that frontier justice might impose on women whose criminal activities violated both civil law and social expectations about feminine behavior that respectable society demanded from ladies whose reputation depended on moral purity and domestic virtue, rather than criminal enterprise and physical courage. The isolation that her double life required was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as community integration deepened her appreciation for honest relationships and normal social interaction that criminal secrecy was preventing through constant deception and emotional distance that protected operational security while denying personal fulfillment that genuine human connection could provide through friendship and potential romance that her criminal identity made impossible to pursue without risking exposure that would destroy both legitimate reputation and criminal operations whose success depended on maintaining perfect separation between public virtue and private criminality. The shipment that would bring Céleste and Étienne together was announced through Wells Fargo notices that described valuable cargo and enhanced security arrangements that challenged her criminal operations through increased difficulty and personal risk that larger payoffs might justify despite tactical complications that professional security guard would create through superior training and equipment that individual criminal could not easily overcome without careful planning and tactical innovation that previous robberies had not required due to inadequate passenger protection and transportation security. The reconnaissance that she conducted revealed Étienne's reputation and professional competence that exceeded previous security arrangements through systematic analysis of his background and tactical capabilities that suggested formidable opposition to criminal operations, whose success had depended on overwhelming unprepared defenders rather than confronting experienced law enforcement professional, whose survival and career advancement required successful protection of cargo and passengers, whose safety was his primary responsibility regardless of personal risk or criminal capability. The plan that she developed for confronting enhanced security included psychological tactics and strategic misdirection that could neutralize professional opposition through surprise and superior positioning rather than direct confrontation that her individual capability could not sustain against trained gunfighter whose experience and equipment provided advantages that careful planning and tactical innovation might overcome through unexpected approaches that conventional criminal methodology would not provide against prepared defender whose competence exceeded normal transportation security. The preparation that was required for challenging professional security included equipment acquisition and tactical training that enhanced her existing capabilities while developing new techniques for managing complex robbery scenario that multiple passengers and armed guard would create through increased variables and potential complications that previous operations had not encountered due to inadequate resistance and limited defensive capability that enhanced security arrangements were designed to provide through qualified personnel and improved procedures that criminal success would require superior planning and execution. The morning of the robbery arrived with weather conditions that provided tactical advantages through dust and wind that could conceal approach and retreat while limiting visibility for defensive response. While timing calculations indicated optimal passenger loading and minimal escort presence that created window of opportunity for criminal operation that careful surveillance had identified despite enhanced security measures that Wells Fargo had implemented for protecting valuable cargo, whose loss would represent significant financial impact and professional embarrassment that successful robbery could inflict on company reputation and individual security personnel whose career advancement depended on mission success. The stagecoach that carried Étienne and 5 passengers through Apache Canyon represented routine assignment that his experience had prepared him to handle, despite enhanced security concerns that territorial conditions required for protecting valuable cargo and civilian safety, while his systematic observation of terrain and potential ambush sites reflected professional habits that previous successful operations had developed through encounter with criminal tactics that frontier transportation faced as constant threat to commercial operations and passenger safety that law enforcement resources could not adequately address without private security arrangements. The moment when masked figure appeared from behind desert rocks with drawn pistol created tactical situation that Étienne's training had prepared him to handle through immediate assessment of threat level and optimal response that could protect passengers while preserving cargo whose value made it primary target for criminal enterprise. While his recognition of Bandit's professional competence and calm demeanor suggested experienced criminal whose capability exceeded normal frontier desperation through systematic planning and tactical knowledge that indicated dangerous opponent requiring careful response rather than immediate aggression. The voice that issued robbery demands was unmistakably feminine despite attempted masculine inflection, while cultured speech and educated vocabulary revealed background that challenged Étienne's assumptions about frontier criminality and created immediate curiosity about circumstances that could drive respectable woman to highway robbery, despite obvious refinement and social advantages that should have provided legitimate alternatives to criminal enterprise that desperate poverty or social ostracism might have eliminated through circumstances that frontier life sometimes imposed on women whose survival required unconventional choices. The conversation that developed during robbery proceedings included unexpected courtesy and intellectual engagement that transformed routine criminal transaction into fascinating encounter between 2 individuals whose backgrounds and circumstances had created unlikely meeting in desert setting where conventional social introduction was impossible despite immediate recognition of mutual interest and compatibility that criminal circumstances were preventing from normal development through shared appreciation for intelligence and competence that each displayed despite opposing positions in dramatic confrontation. The moment when Celeste's gun hand wavered during final demand for valuables revealed internal conflict between criminal necessity and growing personal interest in security guard, whose professional competence and personal charm had created emotional complication that she had never experienced during previous robberies, while Étienne's observation of her hesitation suggested opportunity for connection that transcended criminal circumstances through recognition of shared humanity and potential for relationship. That impossible situation was somehow making possible despite social barriers and legal complications that discovery would create. The decision that crystallized in Étienne's mind was born from months of loneliness and instant recognition that the woman threatening him represented everything he had unconsciously sought in frontier territory, where conventional romance was limited by social circumstances and professional obligations that had prevented meaningful relationships with respectable women whose lives were constrained by community expectations and domestic responsibilities that his nomadic existence could not accommodate through traditional courtship and marriage arrangements that territorial society demanded from serious romantic attachment. The ring that he produced from his vest pocket had belonged to his grandmother, whose dying wish had been that it would someday grace the hand of woman worthy of family heritage and capable of providing happiness that his previous romantic relationships had failed to achieve through incompatibility or circumstances that prevented permanent commitment, despite mutual affection that time and separation had eroded through practical considerations and social pressure that demanded conventional arrangements rather than unconventional love that criminal circumstances were somehow making possible. The words that accompanied his proposal were spoken with conviction that surprised him through their sincerity and emotional intensity. While his recognition that he was offering marriage to armed criminal who had just robbed him created cognitive dissonance, that love was somehow resolving through immediate certainty that conventional courtship could never have produced, despite rational objections that practical considerations should have raised about compatibility and social consequences that such unconventional marriage would create for both participants whose backgrounds and circumstances seemed incompatible. The reaction from other passengers included shocked silence and whispered speculation about security guards' sanity, while their obvious terror was gradually replaced by fascination with unprecedented romantic drama that was unfolding before their eyes in desert setting where impossible things sometimes happened, despite civilized expectations and social conventions that frontier life consistently challenged through circumstances that Eastern society could never have imagined or approved, despite human emotions that transcended geographical boundaries and social limitations that conventional wisdom considered absolute. The tension that filled the air like electricity before thunderstorm reflected magnitude of decision that Céleste faced between criminal independence and conventional marriage that offered security and social acceptance at cost of freedom and adventure that outlaw life provided, despite dangers and moral complications that her double existence had created through systematic deception and criminal activities that discovery would make impossible to continue regardless of personal preferences and emotional attachments that unexpected encounter had somehow generated through immediate recognition of compatibility that circumstances were preventing from normal development. The bandana that Céleste slowly lowered revealed features that exceeded Étienne's expectations despite glimpses of beauty that her disguise had not completely concealed. While recognition of intelligence and strength in emerald eyes that met his gaze confirmed his intuitive assessment of character and capability that had motivated his impossible proposal. Despite criminal circumstances that rational consideration should have made prohibitive for serious romantic attachment between law enforcement professional and systematic criminal, whose activities violated everything his career represented through constitutional obligation and professional responsibility. The silence that followed her revelation was broken by whispered recognition from female passenger whose previous patronage of Amaranth Creek seamstress had created familiarity with Céleste's legitimate identity. While shocked exclamations about respected community members' criminal activities transformed robbery scene into dramatic revelation that challenged assumptions about feminine virtue and social respectability that frontier communities maintained despite obvious evidence that survival sometimes required choices that conventional morality could not accommodate through rigid adherence to social expectations that circumstances might make impossible to maintain. The confession that began flowing from Celeste's lips included explanation of circumstances that had driven her to criminal activities despite education and social advantages that should have provided legitimate alternatives to highway robbery, while her account of personal tragedy and financial desperation revealed background that transformed her from simple criminal into sympathetic figure whose illegal activities were motivated by survival necessity rather than criminal inclination, that conventional judgment would have assumed, despite obvious refinement and moral struggle that her emotional distress was revealing. The story that she told included death of beloved father and loss of family fortune through business betrayal that had left her alone and destitute in a world where women's options were limited by social constraints and economic reality that made honest survival difficult for unprotected females, whose education and refinement provided no practical skills for self-support in frontier environment where physical capability and practical knowledge were more valuable than social accomplishments and cultural refinement that civilized society had emphasized during her privileged upbringing. The desperation that had motivated her criminal career was balanced by hope that sufficient illegal profits could enable legitimate business establishment and honest future that her accumulated wealth was finally making possible despite criminal methods that she planned to abandon once financial security was achieved through final robbery operations that would provide foundation for conventional life and respectable marriage that her growing feelings for security guard were making more attractive than continued criminal independence despite freedom and excitement that outlaw existence had provided. The decision that Celeste faced involved choosing between criminal independence that had provided freedom and excitement despite moral complications and constant danger, and conventional marriage that offered security and social acceptance at cost of adventure and individual autonomy that outlaw life had enabled through rejection of social constraints and feminine limitations that respectable society imposed on women whose behavior was measured by domestic virtue rather than personal capability and individual achievement that criminal success had demonstrated despite illegal methods and social disapproval. The consideration of Étienne's proposal required realistic assessment of compatibility and practical implications of marriage between law enforcement professional and reformed criminal whose background would create social complications and potential legal difficulties that conventional courtship would never have encountered, despite obvious mutual attraction and intellectual compatibility that immediate recognition had revealed through unprecedented circumstances that traditional romance could not have produced through normal social interaction and gradual courtship that territorial isolation made difficult for independent women. The alternative that criminal continuation represented included increasing danger and moral isolation that systematic illegal activities were creating through accumulating guilt and fear of discovery that successful operations had not eliminated despite financial rewards and personal satisfaction that outsmarting law enforcement had provided through demonstration of capability and intelligence that feminine education was not supposed to develop according to social expectations about women's proper roles and appropriate behavior that frontier survival sometimes required individuals to abandon. The hope that marriage offered included opportunity for honest relationship and conventional happiness that her double life had made impossible through constant deception and emotional distance, that protecting criminal identity required, despite growing desire for genuine human connection and normal social interaction, that community integration had revealed as valuable, despite risks to operational security, that personal relationships created through emotional vulnerability and potential exposure that intimate knowledge could provide about criminal activities and true identity. The moment when she holstered her pistol and stepped toward kneeling suitor represented decision that transcended rational consideration through recognition that love offered redemption and transformation that solitary criminal existence could never achieve despite material success and personal independence that illegal activities had provided at cost of moral compromise and social isolation, that conventional marriage could resolve through legitimate partnership and mutual support that individual survival strategies could not provide despite their temporary effectiveness for addressing immediate needs. The terms that needed to be established for their unconventional engagement included immediate cessation of criminal activities and systematic restitution of stolen property that Celeste's career had accumulated through successful robberies. While Étienne's professional obligation required reporting criminal activities to proper authorities, despite personal involvement and romantic attachment that created conflict between duty and desire that frontier relationships sometimes produced when circumstances challenged conventional boundaries between legal obligation and personal loyalty, that love could inspire despite professional responsibilities and social expectations. The compromise that was negotiated between duty and love included Celeste's voluntary surrender of criminal proceeds and cooperation with law enforcement investigation that could minimize legal consequences through demonstrated remorse and systematic restitution that might satisfy justice demands without requiring imprisonment that would separate new couple whose relationship represented hope for rehabilitation and social integration that punitive justice might prevent through institutional incarceration that would eliminate opportunity for personal transformation that marriage and community acceptance could provide. The practical arrangements that were required for implementing their agreement included immediate travel to territorial capital, where federal authorities could evaluate criminal activities and determine appropriate legal response that took into account voluntary surrender and restitution efforts that demonstrated genuine reform and desire for legitimate future rather than simple attempt to avoid punishment through deceptive cooperation that would not represent actual transformation of character and commitment to honest behavior that marriage relationship would require for successful partnership and social acceptance. The emotional negotiation that accompanied practical planning included honest discussion of expectations and concerns about unconventional marriage between law enforcement professional and reformed criminal whose backgrounds created potential conflicts and social complications that conventional courtship would never have encountered. Despite obvious compatibility and mutual affection that unprecedented circumstances had revealed through immediate recognition of shared values and complementary capabilities that partnership could enhance through legitimate cooperation rather than criminal enterprise. The agreement that was reached satisfied both practical necessity and romantic desire through balanced approach that honored legal obligations while protecting relationship that offered hope for happiness and social integration that neither participant could achieve independently, despite individual capabilities and achievements that criminal success and professional competence had demonstrated through their respective careers. That convergence was transforming into foundation for legitimate partnership and conventional future that both desired despite unconventional circumstances of their meeting. The travel arrangements that were made for reaching territorial capital included careful planning for protecting Celeste from vigilante justice and ensuring safe passage for cargo that she had agreed to return along with systematic accounting of criminal proceeds that voluntary restitution required, despite personal cost and legal risk that cooperation with authorities represented for reformed criminal whose future depended on official mercy and community forgiveness that genuine remorse might earn through demonstrated commitment to honest behavior and legitimate social contribution. The relationship that developed during extended journey included deepening emotional connection and practical discussion of future plans that marriage would require, despite uncertain legal outcome and social complications that their unconventional courtship would create in communities where respectable women were not supposed to possess criminal backgrounds or frontier skills that Celeste's outlaw career had developed through necessity and survival instinct that conventional feminine education had not provided through domestic training that emphasized virtue over capability. The conversations that filled travel hours revealed shared values and compatible personalities that criminal circumstances had prevented from normal development through conventional courtship, while mutual respect and intellectual engagement created foundation for lasting partnership. Despite different backgrounds and professional obligations, that convergence was transforming into complementary strengths that marriage could utilize for building legitimate future together through cooperation and mutual support that individual efforts could not achieve despite personal competence and determination. The challenges that were encountered during journey included suspicious communities and law enforcement officials whose knowledge of Celeste's criminal reputation created danger from summary justice and vigilante action that federal protection was necessary to prevent through official escort and legal guarantee that voluntary surrender would be honored through proper judicial process rather than frontier justice that might eliminate opportunity for rehabilitation and redemption that their relationship represented through transformation of criminal into reformed citizen whose marriage could serve community benefit. The arrival at territorial capital marked beginning of legal process that would determine whether justice could accommodate rehabilitation through mercy and restitution rather than punishment through incarceration that would separate couple whose relationship offered hope for social integration and personal transformation. That conventional criminal justice might prevent through institutional approach that emphasized retribution over reformation, despite obvious evidence of genuine change and commitment to legitimate future that love had inspired through unprecedented circumstances. The hearing that was conducted before federal judge Antoine Rousseau represented crucial test of territorial justice system's capacity for mercy and rehabilitation, when faced with voluntary surrender and systematic restitution by criminal whose cooperation and demonstrated remorse challenged conventional approaches to punishment through innovative legal precedent that could establish framework for treating reformed criminals who showed genuine desire for legitimate social integration rather than continued illegal activity that traditional incarceration was designed to prevent through deterrent effect rather than positive transformation. The testimony that Celeste provided included complete confession of criminal activities and detailed explanation of circumstances that had motivated her illegal career despite education and social advantages that should have provided legitimate alternatives to highway robbery, while her obvious intelligence and articulate presentation created favorable impression that challenged stereotypes about criminal character and capability for rehabilitation through proper motivation and social support that marriage relationship could provide through stable foundation for honest behavior. The evidence that was presented for systematic restitution included return of stolen property and financial compensation that exceeded legal requirements through voluntary contribution of personal assets that demonstrated commitment to making amends for criminal activities despite personal cost that such generosity represented for individual whose future security depended on retaining resources for legitimate business establishment and conventional marriage that legal cooperation was making possible through judicial mercy and community acceptance. The character witnesses that testified on Celeste's behalf included Amaranth Creek residents whose positive experience with her legitimate business and community involvement provided evidence of capability for honest behavior and social contribution that criminal background had not eliminated despite illegal activities that had been conducted in secret while maintaining respectable public identity through systematic deception that had protected both criminal operations and community relationships from mutual discovery and negative consequences. The decision that Judge Rousseau announced represented unprecedented application of mercy through suspended sentence and probationary supervision that recognized rehabilitation potential while establishing legal precedent for treating voluntary surrender and systematic restitution as factors that could justify alternative approaches to criminal justice when circumstances suggested genuine reform and social integration rather than continued threat to community safety that traditional punishment was designed to address through deterrent incarceration. The announcement of engagement between reformed criminal and law enforcement professional created sensation throughout territorial capital, whose citizens had never witnessed such unconventional romance. While social reaction ranged from shocked disapproval to grudging admiration for couple whose love had transcended legal boundaries and social conventions through unprecedented circumstances that challenged assumptions about criminal character and rehabilitation potential that conventional wisdom had considered impossible despite obvious evidence of genuine transformation that legal cooperation and voluntary restitution had demonstrated through systematic commitment to honest behavior. The preparations that were required for frontier wedding included acquisition of appropriate clothing and arrangements for ceremony that could accommodate social complications created by bride's criminal background, despite her reformed status and legal rehabilitation that federal mercy had enabled through suspended sentence and probationary supervision that required continued demonstration of legitimate behavior and community contribution that marriage relationship was expected to support through stable foundation for honest social integration and conventional domestic life. The challenges that were encountered during planning included identifying clergy willing to perform ceremony for couple whose backgrounds created theological and social complications that conventional religious authority was reluctant to address, despite obvious sincerity and genuine reformation that their relationship represented through transformation of criminal behavior into legitimate social contribution that marriage could enhance through mutual support and shared commitment to honest behavior that community acceptance was gradually acknowledging despite initial skepticism and moral reservation. The support that was gradually developed included assistance from community members whose recognition of Celeste's positive contributions and Étienne's professional integrity created foundation for social acceptance that unconventional marriage would require for successful integration into respectable society where criminal backgrounds were normally considered permanent disqualification from conventional relationships, despite evidence of genuine reform and moral transformation that love had inspired through unprecedented circumstances that challenged traditional assumptions about character and rehabilitation potential. The excitement that was building toward wedding ceremony included recognition that their marriage would establish legal and social precedent for reformed criminals whose voluntary cooperation and systematic restitution might earn community acceptance and legitimate social integration rather than permanent ostracism and legal punishment that conventional justice typically imposed despite rehabilitation potential that proper motivation and social support could enable through stable relationships and honest employment that former criminals could achieve through genuine commitment to transformed behavior. The ceremony that was conducted in territorial capital's largest church represented triumph of love over legal complications and social prejudice that had initially seemed insurmountable, while community attendance that exceeded expectations demonstrated growing acceptance of unconventional couple whose genuine affection and mutual respect had overcome skepticism about marriage between law enforcement professional and reformed criminal whose transformation had been validated through federal clemency and systematic restitution that proved sincerity of reformation and commitment to legitimate future together. The vows that were exchanged included traditional promises enhanced by personal commitment to honesty and mutual support that their unique circumstances required for successful marriage, despite challenges that criminal background would continue creating through social judgment and professional complications that law enforcement career might encounter through association with reformed outlaw whose past could affect Étienne's advancement and reputation despite obvious character improvement and legal rehabilitation that federal mercy had recognized. The celebration that followed formal ceremony included participation from diverse community members whose initial reservation had been overcome by recognition of couples' genuine love and commitment to legitimate social contribution, while festivities that extended throughout evening demonstrated territorial society's capacity for forgiveness and acceptance when confronted with evidence of sincere transformation and systematic effort to make amends for previous criminal behavior through voluntary cooperation and financial restitution that exceeded legal requirements. The gifts that were presented to new couple included practical items for establishing household and symbolic tokens of community acceptance that represented hope for successful marriage and continued social integration despite unconventional circumstances of their meeting and courtship that had challenged every assumption about proper romantic development and appropriate partner selection that respectable society normally demanded from serious relationships between individuals whose backgrounds and professions created natural compatibility rather than fundamental conflict. The departure that concluded wedding celebration marked beginning of married life for couple whose love had been forged in extraordinary circumstances and tested through legal challenges that would have destroyed conventional relationships, while their journey toward new home and shared future represented victory of personal transformation and social acceptance over criminal background and legal complications that proper motivation and genuine commitment had overcome through unprecedented demonstration of character change and community integration. The homestead that Étienne and Céleste established near Prescott represented their commitment to honest agricultural life and legitimate social contribution that would demonstrate continued reformation while providing foundation for family development and community integration that criminal background might have prevented without systematic effort to prove reliability and moral transformation through consistent behavior and constructive activity that farming operation could provide through productive labor and economic contribution to territorial development that honest citizens were expected to maintain. The business that they developed combined Celeste's skills in horse training and Étienne's knowledge of territorial transportation needs through breeding and training operation that served Wells Fargo and other commercial enterprises whose expansion required reliable livestock and experienced animal handlers whose services were essential for frontier economic development and improved communication that territorial growth demanded, despite challenges that climate and terrain created for conventional agricultural and commercial operations that required specialized knowledge and practical experience. The acceptance that was gradually earned from neighboring ranchers and townspeople reflected recognition of their honest labor and reliable character that daily demonstration of reformed behavior had established through consistent performance and community cooperation that challenged initial skepticism about former criminals' capacity for legitimate social integration and productive contribution to territorial society, whose prosperity depended on mutual trust and cooperative effort among settlers, whose individual success required community support and shared commitment to honest business practices. The challenges that were faced during first year of marriage included financial pressure and social complications that criminal background continued creating despite legal rehabilitation and obvious character transformation, while their love and mutual support enabled them to overcome obstacles that would have defeated less committed couples through shared dedication to proving that rehabilitation was possible and marriage could provide foundation for complete social integration despite unconventional circumstances that had brought them together. The satisfaction that was achieved through honest success and growing community respect validated their choice to build legitimate life together despite easier alternatives that might have been available through return to criminal activities or departure to regions where criminal background would not be known to neighbors whose acceptance was essential for long-term happiness and social integration that conventional marriage required for successful family development and community contribution that territorial society expected from respectable citizens. The investigation that was reopened into Celeste's criminal activities by newly appointed territorial marshal represented threat to peaceful life they had built through honest labor and community integration, while political pressure from Eastern authorities who questioned federal clemency and suspected incomplete prosecution created legal jeopardy that could destroy marriage and social acceptance. Despite years of demonstrated reformation and systematic contribution to territorial development that should have validated judicial decision to emphasize rehabilitation over punishment through suspended sentence and probationary supervision. The evidence that was being reviewed included testimony from robbery victims and law enforcement officials whose accounts contradicted official records about extent of criminal activities and potential accomplices whose identity had never been revealed through original investigation, while suspicion about incomplete cooperation and possible concealed assets created foundation for renewed prosecution that could eliminate legal immunity and result in imprisonment that would separate couple whose relationship had been built on transformation and community integration that new legal action threatened to destroy. The pressure that was applied through unofficial channels included hints about federal review and possible reversal of clemency decision if additional evidence emerged about unreported criminal activities or undisclosed assets that systematic investigation might reveal through examination of financial records and property acquisitions that honest income could not have supported without criminal supplementation. That original restitution might not have addressed completely, despite voluntary cooperation that had earned initial legal mercy. The decision that confronted them involved choosing between continued resistance to legal pressure that might eventually prove unsuccessful against federal authority, or voluntary disclosure of remaining information and assets that complete honesty would require, despite personal cost and potential legal consequences that full cooperation might create through revelation of details that original confession had not included due to protective instinct and fear of consequences that complete transparency might have generated. The support that was offered by community members whose respect and friendship had been earned through years of honest behavior included financial assistance and legal advice that could help them navigate renewed investigation, while local political influence and character testimony provided foundation for resistance to external pressure that threatened to destroy rehabilitation success and social integration that their marriage had achieved through systematic demonstration of transformation and commitment to legitimate behavior that territorial society had gradually accepted. The choice that Céleste made to provide complete disclosure despite personal risk represented ultimate test of transformation and commitment to honesty that marriage had inspired through recognition that partial truth would always create vulnerability to legal challenge and social suspicion, while complete transparency offered only path to permanent security and unqualified community acceptance that their relationship deserved after years of demonstrated reformation and systematic contribution to territorial development that honest behavior had enabled, despite criminal background, that continued creating complications. The revelation that accompanied complete confession included disclosure of hidden assets and criminal associates whose identity had been protected through loyalty and fear despite legal pressure for cooperation, while her systematic exposure of remaining criminal network provided law enforcement intelligence that exceeded value of continued prosecution through information that could eliminate organized criminal activity and protect territorial commerce from systematic robbery that had been threatening Wells Fargo operations and passenger safety throughout Arizona territory. The federal response to complete cooperation included recognition that rehabilitation had been successfully achieved through marriage and community integration that demonstrated genuine transformation rather than temporary deception, while practical value of criminal intelligence that complete confession provided outweighed punitive considerations that vengeful prosecution might have served through punishment that would eliminate valuable asset for continued law enforcement cooperation and territorial security that reformed criminal could provide through unique knowledge and community position. The legal resolution that was negotiated included permanent immunity and official recognition of rehabilitation in exchange for continued cooperation with law enforcement and systematic assistance in tracking remaining criminal elements whose activities threatened territorial commerce and passenger safety, while her integration into legitimate law enforcement network provided unprecedented resource for combating organized crime through insider knowledge and systematic intelligence that conventional investigation could not obtain through normal channels. The vindication that was achieved through legal resolution and community support validated their faith in transformation and redemption that love had enabled through marriage relationship, while official recognition of rehabilitation and systematic contribution to law enforcement created foundation for permanent social acceptance and legitimate future that criminal background would no longer threaten through legal vulnerability or social suspicion, that complete honesty and systematic cooperation had finally eliminated through demonstrated commitment to constitutional authority and community welfare. The telegram that arrived 2 years after their legal vindication contained assignment that would bring their story full circle through Wells Fargo request for Celeste's assistance in training female security personnel whose deployment could address criminal activities that conventional male protection could not prevent through systematic exploitation of social assumptions about feminine capability and criminal potential that her unique experience had revealed through unprecedented combination of criminal knowledge and reformed character that law enforcement cooperation had established. The irony that was inherent in transformation from highway robber to security consultant represented complete reversal of identity and social purpose that marriage and community integration had enabled through systematic demonstration of rehabilitation and commitment to legitimate social contribution, while her specialized knowledge of criminal techniques and psychological understanding of outlaw mentality provided law enforcement advantages that conventional training could not produce through academic study rather than practical experience with criminal operations and frontier survival. The program that was developed through their cooperation included systematic training of female agents whose deployment could revolutionize territorial security through exploitation of criminal assumptions about feminine helplessness and social limitations that systematic gender bias had created in outlaw community, whose tactical planning did not account for possibility of armed female opposition or systematic female participation in law enforcement operations that conventional wisdom considered impossible despite obvious capability that proper training could develop. The success that was achieved through innovative security program exceeded Wells Fargo expectations while establishing precedent for female participation in law enforcement activities that territorial development was beginning to require through expanding criminal sophistication and organized opposition that conventional male-dominated approaches could not address without enhanced personnel and tactical innovation that gender integration could provide through systematic utilization of resources that social prejudice had previously prevented from contributing to community safety. The recognition that was earned through professional achievement and social contribution completed transformation from criminal outcast to respected community leader, whose expertise and integrity served territorial welfare through legitimate channels rather than illegal enterprise, while her marriage and family development demonstrated that criminal background did not preclude successful social integration when proper motivation and community support enabled genuine reformation through systematic commitment to honest behavior and constructive social participation. 25 years after the stagecoach robbery that had ended in a wedding proposal, Céleste and Étienne Moreau stood together on the porch of their prosperous ranch, watching their 3 children play in the yard, while the Arizona sunset painted the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded them of the extraordinary afternoon when impossible love had triumphed over legal boundaries and social conventions, through recognition that true partnership could transform criminal desperation into legitimate success and community respect. that sustained effort and genuine commitment had earned through systematic demonstration of character and capability. The Wells Fargo training academy that bore Celeste's name was graduating its 15th class of female security agents, whose deployment throughout territorial regions had virtually eliminated systematic robbery through innovative tactics and gender-integrated operations that her pioneering work had established as standard practice. While federal recognition of her contribution to law enforcement and territorial security had created legal precedent for rehabilitation and social integration that emphasized transformation over punishment when genuine reform was demonstrated through sustained commitment to legitimate behavior and community contribution. The grandchildren who were beginning to arrive brought joy that exceeded anything their unconventional courtship could have predicted. While family gatherings that included former passengers from that famous stagecoach robbery created living testimony to power of love and forgiveness that had transformed criminal encounter into foundation for legitimate dynasty whose prosperity and respectability challenged every assumption about criminal character and rehabilitation potential that frontier society had maintained, despite obvious evidence that proper motivation could inspire complete transformation of identity and social purpose. The community leadership that both had achieved through decades of honest service included civic positions and business success that demonstrated complete social integration despite criminal background that had initially seemed to preclude conventional marriage and respectable future, while their example had inspired territorial policies that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment when voluntary cooperation and systematic restitution demonstrated genuine desire for legitimate social contribution rather than continued criminal activity that traditional justice typically assumed was inevitable. The love that had begun with impossible proposal in desert setting had grown through shared challenges and mutual support into partnership that exceeded conventional marriage through depth of commitment and breadth of achievement that their unique circumstances had enabled, while their story continued inspiring frontier communities whose development required recognition that individual transformation was possible when proper motivation met community support and legal mercy enabled second chances for persons whose criminal past did not define future potential for honest success and social contribution. As stars emerged in desert sky that had witnessed their extraordinary meeting, the wedding ring that still gleamed on Celeste's finger caught starlight like captured fire, reflecting eternal truth that love could indeed conquer all obstacles when courage met opportunity, and human hearts proved stronger than social conventions. In territories where impossible dreams sometimes became magnificent reality, through faith in redemption and commitment to transformation that transcended every limitation except those imposed by individual choice between honest love and continued deception, while their legacy of successful rehabilitation and community integration would inspire generations of frontier families whose own challenges could be overcome through recognition that criminal background was not permanent destiny, but temporary condition, that proper motivation and sustained effort could transform into foundation for legitimate achievement and social respect in America's magnificent desert territories, where love built bridges between impossible circumstances and extraordinary happiness that exceeded everything conventional wisdom considered achievable.